Part 1. Beneath the cracked glass. The first indication that something was wrong came shortly after 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Albert Finch removed his cap and wiped perspiration from his forehead. Blast these old places. His assistant, George Miller, knelt beside the lifted floor tiles. They don't build them like this anymore. Albert grunted. They had too much time on their hands. The Victorian greenhouse behind Hawthorne Lodge had remained unused for decades. Its once magnificent glass roof bore cracks and patches of moss. Dead vines clung stubbornly to iron supports. Dust softened every surface. Even sunlight filtering through fractured panes appeared hesitant. Mrs. Edith Langley stood near the doorway. At 73, she remained elegant despite advancing years. Hawthorne Lodge had belonged to her family for nearly half a century. "It's quite sad seeing it dismantled," she remarked. Albert glanced around. "It'll be beautiful once restored." Mrs. Langley smiled faintly. "My husband loved this greenhouse." George carefully removed another section of tile. "Looks like they've repaired the floor before." Albert crouched beside him. "What? Different mortar?" He tapped gently against the concrete beneath. "Hollow." Silence settled briefly. Mrs. Langley looked toward them. "Is something wrong?" George reached for his tools. "Probably old drainage."
The sound echoed strangely beneath the floor. Albert frowned.
"Dig carefully."
Minutes passed. Dust rose into shafts of pale sunlight.
Then George stopped moving entirely. His face had gone white. "Albert, what? I think," his voice faltered, "you'd better look at this." Albert lowered himself awkwardly. Fragments of earth had emerged beneath the broken concrete. Something pale protruded through the soil. At first glance it resembled a root. Then understanding arrived. The workman stumbled backward. "Oh, God!" Mrs. Langley stared. "What is it?" Neither man answered immediately. George swallowed hard. "Someone call the police." Silence engulfed the ruined greenhouse, because beneath the cracked floor of Hawthorne Lodge, a human hand had reached upward through 30 years of carefully cultivated silence. By midday, Inspector Dermot Craddock stood inside the greenhouse. Autumn sunlight filtered through broken glass overhead. Police officers moved carefully around the excavation site. Dr. Harriet Collins examined the remains with quiet professionalism. Inspector Craddock removed his hat. "How long?" The doctor looked thoughtful. "Decades. Can you be more specific?" "Approximately 30 years." Silence settled heavily. Mrs. Edith Langley sat nearby, pale but composed. "I don't understand." Craddock looked toward her. "When was this greenhouse last used?" She hesitated. 32 years ago." The inspector lowered his notebook. "Why did it close?" Mrs. Langley's expression altered almost imperceptibly. "There was an accident." "What sort of accident?" Her gaze drifted toward the shattered glass roof. "A young man disappeared." Silence settled instantly. Inspector Craddock looked up. "Stephen Ashcroft." The name lingered within the dusty greenhouse. "Who was he?" Craddock asked. Mrs. Langley folded trembling hands together. "He was a botanist. He worked here. What happened? No one knew." Her voice softened. "He simply vanished. Outside St. Mary Mead had already begun discussing the discovery. Mrs. Bantry arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after tea. "My dear Jane." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Dolly, you'll never believe it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "One rarely does." Mrs. Bantry lowered herself dramatically into a chair. "They found a body, indeed." Beneath Hawthorne Lodge's greenhouse floor. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "How very inconvenient." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Inconvenient? For everyone involved." She folded her knitting carefully. "The dead have an unfortunate tendency to complicate settled narratives." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "Do you remember Stephen Ashcroft?" Miss Marple became thoughtful. "The botanist. You remember. He was charming and very handsome." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "All the village girls adored him. What happened?" "He disappeared." Miss Marple lowered her eyes. People said he'd gone abroad. Mrs. Bantry nodded. They also said he'd abandoned his fiancée. Silence settled between them. Who was she? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Bantry hesitated. Margaret Langley. Miss Marple looked up. Mrs. Edith Langley's daughter? Precisely. Interesting. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock visited St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, Inspector, I suspected you'd already heard. The greenhouse. Craddock nodded. We've begun identifying the remains, and we've found something unusual. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. What?
Inspector Craddock placed a small evidence envelope upon the table. Inside rested a tarnished silver object. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles.
A watch. Yes, the initials. Craddock lowered his voice. They don't belong to Stephen Ashcroft. Silence settled heavily. Mrs. Bantry stared. My goodness. Miss Marple folded her hands. What initials? Inspector Craddock met her gaze. W. Outside. Autumn rain began softly against the cottage windows. Inside, Miss Marple lowered her knitting into her lap. A vanished botanist, a broken engagement, a body hidden beneath greenhouse tiles, and a silver watch belonging to someone else entirely. Then she spoke quietly. The interesting question isn't whether Stephen Ashcroft was murdered. Inspector Craddock waited. It isn't. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No.
She looked thoughtfully toward the rain-speckled garden beyond her window.
The interesting question is whether Stephen Ashcroft was ever beneath that greenhouse floor at all. Silence settled comfortably around them, because 30 years earlier, St. Mary Mead had mourned a young botanist who vanished without explanation. Now the earth itself had objected to the story everyone had accepted. And somewhere beneath decades of roses, roots, and respectable appearances, someone had buried the wrong truth. Part 2. The watch with the wrong initials. Miss Marple had often reflected that villages possessed an extraordinary talent for filling gaps in knowledge. If a young man vanished, someone remembered hearing he had accepted employment overseas. If an engagement ended unexpectedly, another person recalled vague incompatibility. If no explanation presented itself, one was invented. The invented version gradually acquired the comfortable texture of truth. People repeated it at garden parties. They mentioned it over tea. Eventually, they no longer distinguished between what they knew and what they preferred to believe. The difficulty arose when facts emerged from beneath greenhouse floors. Outside, autumn rain drifted softly across St. Mary Mead. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, Inspector Craddock placed the small evidence envelope carefully upon the table. The silver watch gleamed faintly beneath the lamp. Mrs. Bantry adjusted her spectacles. Doubloosh! Inspector Craddock nodded. The initials were engraved professionally. Miss Marple lowered her knitting. And Stephen Ashcroft's initials? Essay silence settled comfortably. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Could the watch have belonged to a previous owner? It appears contemporary with the estimated time of death, Craddock replied. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. Then the obvious conclusion becomes less obvious. Inspector Craddock looked toward her. You believe the remains belong to someone else? I believe, Miss Marple said gently, that one should avoid identifying skeletons according to village expectations. Mrs. Bantry sighed. Really, Jane? Must you always make things complicated? My dear Dolly, Miss Marple replied softly, murder generally arrives already complicated.
Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock returned to Hawthorne Lodge. The greenhouse had been sealed.
Police officers moved carefully among excavation equipment and broken tiles. Dr. Harriet Collins stood near the exposed section of earth. What have we learned? Craddock asked. The doctor removed her gloves. The remains belonged to an adult male, age approximately 30 to 40, and, she hesitated, there appears to have been trauma to the skull. Silence settled heavily. Murder, very likely. Inspector Craddock looked toward the shattered greenhouse roof. 30 years ago. Approximately. Mrs. Edith Langley sat nearby, composed, elegant, exhausted. I still cannot believe this. Craddock lowered himself into the chair opposite her. Mrs. Langley. Inspector, tell me about Stephen Ashcroft. Silence lingered. Then she folded her hands carefully. He arrived in St. Mary Mead 33 years ago. What sort of man was he? Charming. The answer arrived immediately. Intelligent. He transformed the greenhouse. What happened afterward? Mrs. Langley's gaze drifted toward the neglected structure. My daughter fell in love. Margaret Langley, the broken engagement. What did you think of him? Craddock asked. A pause. I liked him. Another pause. I didn't entirely trust him. Interesting. Why not? He seemed restless. Silence settled, as though Hawthorne Lodge represented a temporary arrangement. Did Stephen have enemies, Mrs.? Langley looked genuinely puzzled. None that I knew. What happened before he disappeared? Her fingers tightened together. The engagement ended. Why? Margaret's voice softened. My daughter never explained. Outside, villagers had already begun gathering near gates and hedges. St. Mary Mead disliked uncertainty. Uncertainty encouraged imagination. Mrs. Price Ridley spoke quietly to Mrs. Bartlett. I always said there was something peculiar. Mrs. Bartlett lowered her voice. He was far too handsome. Mr. Simpkins joined them. They claimed he'd accepted a position in South America. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. People claim many things. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple listened thoughtfully as Mrs. Bantry repeated every rumor currently circulating. Dolly? Yes? Who originally announced Stephen Ashcroft had gone abroad? Mrs. Bantry blinked. My goodness, I've no idea. Exactly. Silence followed. Miss Marple folded her knitting. Villages possess collective memories, but no one ever remembers where the story began. The following morning, Inspector Craddock visited Margaret Langley. Now Margaret Fletcher through marriage. She lived several miles from Hawthorne Lodge. At 63, she retained traces of considerable beauty. Only her eyes betrayed weariness. Mrs. Fletcher. Inspector, you understand why I've come? She nodded. The greenhouse. Silence settled heavily. You were engaged to Stephen Ashcroft. Yes. What happened? Margaret looked toward the rain-streaked windows. He ended it. Why? He said marriage required certainty, and he lacked it. Inspector Craddock waited. Did he explain further? No. How did you react? Margaret smiled faintly. Badly. Silence followed. I accused him of cowardice. What happened afterward? He disappeared. Did you believe he'd gone abroad? Margaret lowered her gaze. No. The answer startled him. What did you believe? She hesitated. I believed he ran away. Why? Because people do. Miss Marple arrived shortly afterward, accompanied by Mrs. Bantry. Margaret greeted them politely. My dear Margaret, Miss Marple said gently. You remember Stephen clearly? Of course. Tell me something. What? What was he afraid of? Silence settled. Margaret stared. Afraid? Everyone fears something. Finally, Margaret replied quietly. He hated disappointing people. Miss Marple lowered her eyes thoughtfully. Interesting. Very interesting. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock returned carrying another discovery. We found personal effects. Mrs. Bantry nearly spilled her tea. What sort? A signet ring. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. Initials? No, what then? A crest.
Silence settled heavily. Craddock handed over the photograph. Miss Marple studied it carefully. A small shield, an oak tree, 3 stars. Mrs.
Bantry frowned. Do you recognize it? Miss Marple looked thoughtful. No, but someone in St. Mary Mead will. Outside, church bells echoed softly through autumn air. Inside Hawthorne Lodge, Edith Langley sat alone beside the drawing-room fire. A photograph rested in her hands. Stephen Ashcroft smiled confidently from another era. Young, handsome. Alive. Footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Margaret entered quietly. They've found more evidence. Edith lowered the photograph. I know. Silence settled. Then Margaret asked softly, Mother. Yes? Did Stephen truly go abroad? The older woman closed her eyes briefly. I don't know. It sounded less convincing than either of them wished. That evening, Miss Marple walked slowly through her garden. Mrs. Bantry accompanied her. Jane. Yes, Dolly. Do you think the body belongs to Stephen? Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. My dear, people rarely vanish without assistance. You mean murder, sometimes. And sometimes, she added softly, they vanish because others permit them to. Mrs. Bantry frowned. I don't understand. Miss Marple looked toward the autumn roses climbing her fence. The body beneath the greenhouse belonged to a man with the initials W.H. He suffered violence, yet saint. Mary Mead immediately assumed Stephen Ashcroft had finally been discovered. Silence followed. Miss Marple folded her hands. I think the village has spent 30 years mourning the wrong person. The church clock struck 6. Darkness gathered gently over St. Mary Mead. Inspector Craddock's motor car appeared moments later. He stepped out carrying another file. Miss Marple! Inspector, we've identified the crest. Mrs. Bantry inhaled sharply. Well? Craddock lowered his voice. It belonged to the Hargreaves family. Silence settled instantly. Miss Marple looked up. Hargreaves? Yes. What connection had they to Hawthorne Lodge? The inspector hesitated, then replied quietly, 31 years ago, a man named William Hargreaves worked there as a gardener. Mrs. Bantry stared. Ouch!
Miss Marple lowered her knitting into her lap. A vanished botanist. A broken engagement. A body beneath the greenhouse floor.
And now, a gardener no one had mentioned. She looked thoughtfully toward the gathering darkness beyond her window. Because somewhere beneath decades of roses, roots, and respectable appearances, St. Mary Mead had forgotten an entire man, and Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden not by lies, but by omissions so complete that eventually no one noticed the silence they left behind. Part 3. The gardener no one mentioned Miss Marple had often reflected that forgetting was not always accidental. People forgot birthdays because they were busy. They forgot umbrellas because they were distracted. But they forgot inconvenient people because remembering them required effort they preferred not to make. Servants disappeared from conversations once they left employment. Gardeners became anonymous figures in old photographs. Housemaids transformed into the girl who used to help. Time stripped names from those society considered peripheral. Yet occasionally, Miss Marple thought, the people pushed toward the edges of memory occupied the very center of tragedy. Outside, a thin autumn mist settled over St. Mary Mead.
Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, Inspector Craddock placed William Hargreaves's employment file upon the table. Mrs.
Bantry adjusted her spectacles. My goodness! Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly into her lap. A gardener! Inspector Craddock nodded. Employed at Hawthorne Lodge for approximately 18 months. When? 31 years ago. Silence settled comfortably around them. Mrs. Bantry frowned. And nobody thought to mention him? Apparently not. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. My dear Dolly, gardeners occupy a curious social position. What do you mean? They know everyone's habits. They overhear private conversations. They move freely around property. And yet people seldom notice them. Inspector Craddock opened the file. William Hargreaves was 36, unmarried, previously employed at several country estates. What happened after Hawthorne Lodge? He disappeared. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Disappeared? Officially he resigned, but no subsequent employment records exist. Silence settled heavily. Miss Marple lowered her eyes. Interesting. Very interesting. Later that morning, Inspector Craddock returned to Hawthorne Lodge. The greenhouse remained under police supervision. The exposed earth beneath the cracked floor had become the subject of village fascination. Mrs. Edith Langley sat in the drawing room. She appeared exhausted. Inspector, you never mentioned William Hargreaves. The older woman's expression altered. The gardener? Yes. He worked here. Why didn't you tell us? Mrs. Langley folded trembling hands together. Because I didn't think he mattered. Silence lingered. What sort of man was he? Craddock asked. Quiet, reliable. He kept to himself. Did Stephen Ashcroft know him? Of course. They worked together in the greenhouse. Inspector Craddock looked up sharply. They were close. A pause. I believe so. Outside, autumn wind stirred the ivy-climbing Hawthorne Lodge's stone walls. Inside, another omission emerged. What happened to William? Craddock asked. Mrs. Langley hesitated. I assumed he followed Stephen abroad. Silence settled heavily. You assumed? No one ever asked. Meanwhile, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Bartlett. If St. Mary Mead possessed an unofficial archive, it existed within the memories of elderly villagers. Mrs. Bartlett poured tea thoughtfully. William Hargreaves. You remember him? Miss Marple asked gently. Oh, yes. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. What was he like? Mrs. Bartlett lowered her voice. He adored plants. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. A gardener who adored plants? No, he adored Stephen Ashcroft. Silence filled the room. Mrs. Bantry blinked. My goodness. Miss Marple folded her hands. What do you mean, Mrs.? Bartlett looked uncomfortable. Nothing improper. He simply admired him. They spent hours discussing orchids, seeds, foreign flowers. He followed Stephen about like an eager student. Interesting. Very interesting. What did Stephen think of him? Miss Marple asked. He seemed fond of William. Mrs. Bartlett hesitated. But, I once heard them arguing. The room became still. When? Mrs. Bantry asked. Shortly before Stephen vanished. What about? Mrs. Bartlett lowered her eyes. I couldn't hear clearly, but William sounded upset. What did he say? Silence lingered, then she replied softly, You promised. Outside, church bells echoed faintly across the village. Inside, Miss Marple lowered her gaze thoughtfully. Promises, engagements, disappearances, interesting. That afternoon, Margaret Fletcher arrived unexpectedly at Hawthorne Lodge. Her mother looked up from the drawing-room fire. Margaret! I've been thinking. Edith folded her hands. So have I. Margaret hesitated. Did Stephen ever mention William Hargreaves? Silence settled heavily. Then Edith replied quietly, Once. What did he say? He described William as loyal, and... Edith looked toward the rain-speckled windows. He sounded sad. Margaret frowned. Sad? He said loyalty frightened him. The room became perfectly still. Later that evening, Inspector Craddock returned with another discovery. We've located William Hargreaves' surviving family. Mrs. Bantry nearly spilled her tea. At last, a younger sister. What is her name? Miss Marple asked. Alice Morton. She lives in Kent. What does she remember? Craddock lowered his notebook. Quite a lot.
2 days later, Alice Morton arrived in St. Mary Mead. At 70,
she possessed William's gentle features and steady gaze. My brother wasn't the sort to disappear. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. Tell us about him. Alice smiled sadly. He loved gardens, he hated dishonesty. And Hawthorne Lodge, he wrote letters. Inspector Craddock looked up sharply. Letters? Every week. What happened to them? I kept them. Silence settled heavily. Mrs. Bantry pressed her fingertips together. My goodness! Alice opened her handbag. The bundle of letters had yellowed with age. She handed them over carefully. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. William's handwriting appeared neat, orderly. One letter read, Mr. Ashcroft says orchids bloom best when moved gently into stronger light. Another. Miss Langley is kinder than she realizes. Then Miss Marple stopped reading. What is it? Craddock asked. She lowered the paper. This one. Silence filled the room. William had written, I fear Stephen has made promises he cannot keep. Mrs. Bantry gasped softly. Miss Marple continued reading. He wishes to avoid hurting people. I do not think he understands that indecision wounds more deeply than honesty. The room remained perfectly still. Inspector Craddock folded his arms. What promises? Alice lowered her eyes. My brother never explained. Miss Marple adjusted her knitting. But he knew. Outside, autumn rain began once more against Hawthorne Lodge's ancient windows. Inside, another truth emerged from carefully preserved paper. Stephen Ashcroft, the charming botanist, the beloved fiancé, the man everyone mourned, had apparently spent his final weeks entangled in promises he could not fulfill. Margaret Fletcher looked pale. He promised to marry me. Alice glanced toward her. Perhaps. The silence that followed felt unbearably delicate. Then Alice said quietly, My brother believed Stephen was fundamentally decent. Miss Marple lowered her gaze. That often complicates matters. Later that evening, Inspector Craddock entered Miss Marple's cottage, carrying a final report. We've completed the examination of William Hargreaves's remains. Miss Marple looked up. And there was blunt force trauma. Murder? Without question. Silence settled heavily. Mrs. Bantry sighed. Poor man. Inspector Craddock looked toward Miss Marple. William Hargreaves died beneath that greenhouse. Yes, but Stephen Ashcroft remains missing. Outside, darkness settled over St. Mary Mead. Inside, Miss Marple folded William's letters carefully. A gardener who hated dishonesty. A botanist afraid of disappointing people. A broken engagement. Promises made and postponed. Then she spoke softly. The difficulty with charming people, Inspector, is that they often mistake kindness for avoidance. Craddock waited. And?
Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the autumn garden beyond her window.
I believe Stephen Ashcroft intended to make everyone happy.
Silence lingered. Mrs. Bantry frowned.
That's hardly criminal.
No. Miss Marple's eyes softened.
But when people attempt to preserve every affection, she paused. They sometimes leave others standing exactly where betrayal and desperation meet. Outside, the rain washed gently over roses and roots. Inside, one truth had finally emerged. The body beneath the greenhouse floor belonged not to the man St. Mary Mead had mourned, but to the loyal gardener no one had thought important enough to remember. And somewhere beyond the village's comfortable assumptions, Stephen Ashcroft remained unaccounted for, alive, dead, or carrying a secret so devastating that another man had been buried in his place. Part 4. The letter that should have burned Miss Marple had often reflected that letters possessed a peculiar stubbornness. People wrote them in moments of loneliness, anger, hope, or desperation. They folded them carefully, sealed them with trembling fingers, and sent pieces of themselves into the keeping of others. Some letters were treasured, others were hidden in drawers. A few were burned in fireplaces by people who believed that destroying paper also destroyed consequences. Yet the most troublesome letters, Miss Marple thought, were the ones someone intended to destroy, but never quite managed to discard. They waited patiently between the pages of old books and forgotten boxes, and when they resurfaced years later, they frequently spoke more honestly than living witnesses. Outside, autumn sunlight briefly pierced the clouds hanging over St. Mary Mead. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, William Hargreaves's letters lay neatly arranged upon the table. Mrs. Bantry looked troubled. Poor man! Miss Marple folded her knitting. Yes, he appears to have been both observant and loyal. Inspector Craddock adjusted the papers before him. And murdered. Silence settled heavily. William Hargreaves, the gardener everyone had forgotten, the body beneath the greenhouse floor. The man who had feared Stephen Ashcroft was making promises he could not keep. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Jane? Yes, Dolly? What sort of promises? Miss Marple lowered her eyes thoughtfully. My dear, there was an engagement. Margaret Langley, quite. But William's letters suggest obligations extending beyond romance. Inspector Craddock nodded. He repeatedly mentioned Stephen's inability to disappoint people. And indecision, Miss Marple added softly, is often mistaken for kindness.
Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock returned to Hawthorne Lodge. Margaret Fletcher sat in the morning room overlooking the neglected gardens.
She appeared exhausted. 32 years had transformed youthful heartbreak into something quieter, less painful, perhaps. Mrs. Fletcher. Inspector, I need you to tell me about the anonymous letter. Silence settled instantly. Margaret's expression altered. What letter? The one circulated after Stephen disappeared. She looked toward the windows. I'd forgotten it. Inspector Craddock remained silent. People rarely forgot letters that altered their lives. They said it wasn't genuine. Who said? My mother. What did it contain? Margaret hesitated, then softly replied. It claimed Stephen Ashcroft intended leaving St. Mary Mead. Why? It suggested. She paused. That he'd been leading two people toward expectations he couldn't fulfill. The room became perfectly still. Two people? Margaret lowered her gaze. That was the wording. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across Hawthorne Lodge's lawns. Inside, another possibility emerged. Not one promise, two. Inspector Craddock looked up sharply. What happened to the letter? My mother burned it. Later that evening, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry visited Edith Langley. The older woman received them politely. My dear Edith, Mrs. Bantry began, we've heard about the anonymous letter. Edith's hands tightened around her teacup. I wondered when that would return. Miss Marple regarded her gently. You burned it. Yes. Why? Edith looked toward the fire. Because my daughter had already suffered enough humiliation. Silence settled. What did the letter say? Miss Marple asked softly. Edith closed her eyes briefly. It accused Stephen of dishonesty. And it implied another attachment, Mrs. Bantry blinked. You thought it was nonsense. I hoped it was nonsense. The distinction lingered heavily. Miss Marple folded her hands. Did Margaret see it? No. Why not? Edith's voice softened. Because mothers spend half their lives deciding which truths their daughters can survive. Outside, rain began once more. Inside, Miss Marple lowered her eyes thoughtfully. Protection. Again, interesting. Very interesting. The following morning, Inspector Craddock arrived carrying fresh information. We found something among William Hargreaves's belongings. Mrs. Bantry nearly dropped her teacup. What? A notebook. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. A diary? More a collection of observations.
Silence settled heavily. Craddock opened the small leather book carefully. William's handwriting remained precise. One entry read,
Stephen says honesty creates unnecessary suffering. Another. I disagree. Miss Marple looked up. William Hargreaves had possessed stronger opinions than anyone remembered. Inspector Craddock turned another page. Then what is it? Mrs. Bantry whispered. He lowered his voice. Miss Langley deserves certainty. Silence settled over the room. Another entry followed. He thinks postponement is mercy. I believe it is cowardice. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully into her lap. Poor William. The forgotten gardener had understood Stephen Ashcroft rather well. Inspector Craddock turned another page. His expression altered immediately. What now? Mrs. Bantry asked. Craddock hesitated, then read aloud. If he cannot tell the truth himself, I shall. The room fell perfectly silent. Outside, rainwater streamed down cottage windows. Inside, Miss Marple lowered her gaze. Interesting. Very interesting. William Hargreaves had intended revelation. What truth? Inspector Craddock murmured. No one answered, because the notebook offered no explanation. Only another unfinished entry written shakily across the page. He promised after the war. The sentence ended there. Incomplete. Mrs. Bantry stared. After the war? Miss Marple folded her hands. My dear Dolly, promises made during grief often become impossible burdens afterward. Inspector Craddock looked toward her. You think this concerns wartime? I think, Miss Marple replied gently, that people emerging from loss frequently mistake gratitude for obligation. Silence settled comfortably. Outside, church bells echoed faintly through St. Mary Mead. Inside Hawthorne Lodge, Edith Langley sat alone in the attic. Dust drifted through shafts of pale light. She opened an old trunk, photographs, programs, pressed flowers. Then, hidden beneath folded linen, she found an envelope. Her face lost color. For several moments she simply stared at it. The handwriting remained unmistakable. Stephen Ashcroft. With trembling fingers she opened it. A single sheet rested inside. She read it once. Then again, footsteps sounded behind her. Margaret stood in the doorway. "Mother?" Edith looked up. Tears shimmered unexpectedly in her eyes. "He wrote to me." Margaret stared. "What?" Silence filled the attic. Edith lowered the letter slowly. "He asked me to protect you." Margaret's voice trembled. "When?" 3 days before he disappeared. Outside, autumn wind rattled Hawthorne Lodge's ancient windows. Inside, 32 years collapsed into a single fragile moment. Margaret stepped closer. "What did he say?" Edith hesitated, then whispered, "He wrote." Her voice broke. "I fear my attempt to do right has already ruined everything." Silence engulfed the attic. Later that evening, Inspector Craddock sat opposite Miss Marple. "He wrote to Edith Langley." "Yes." "William intended exposing some truth?" "Yes." "The anonymous letter suggested 2 promises." "Yes." Craddock looked exhausted. "What are we missing?" Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly. Outside, rain softened against the roses in her garden. Inside, she considered Stephen Ashcroft, the charming botanist, the reluctant fiancé, the man who hated disappointing people, the man William Hargreaves had accused of postponing honesty. Then she spoke quietly. "My dear Inspector." "Yes? I don't think Stephen Ashcroft was leading a double life." Silence settled. "You don't?" "No." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the darkened garden beyond her window.
"I think he made one promise out of love."
She paused. "And another out of guilt." Outside, roots spread patiently beneath the earth surrounding Hawthorne Lodge. Inside, another truth began reaching toward the surface. Because William Hargreaves had been prepared to reveal something before he died. Something connected to the war. Something Stephen feared would destroy lives. And somewhere among the letters that should have burned lay the explanation for why a loyal gardener ended beneath the greenhouse floor while the man everyone expected to find remained missing. Part 5. The promise made after the war. Miss Marple had often reflected that wars altered people in ways that peace seldom understood. Those who had not lived through them imagined dramatic transformations, heroism, cowardice, great sacrifice. Yet the quieter changes proved more enduring. People returned home carrying promises made beside hospital beds, debts of gratitude impossible to repay, affections born from shared fear. They married the wrong people because survival had felt like destiny. They avoided difficult conversations because life had already demanded too much courage. And sometimes, years later, ordinary lives collapsed beneath obligations forged during extraordinary times. Outside, autumn sunshine spread across St. Mary Mead after several days of rain. At Hawthorne Lodge, the neglected greenhouse remained silent beneath police supervision. The exposed earth beneath its cracked floor had become a reminder that the past rarely remained buried forever. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, Edith Langley's newly discovered letter rested upon the table. Mrs. Bantry adjusted her spectacles. "My goodness."
Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly into her lap.
"Indeed."
Inspector Craddock reread Stephen Ashcroft's words.
"I fear my attempt to do right has already ruined everything." Silence settled comfortably around them. Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Jane." "Yes, Dolly? What sort of promise ruins everything?" Miss Marple lowered her eyes thoughtfully. "My dear, promises made from guilt frequently prove far more destructive than promises made from love." Inspector Craddock looked toward her. "You think Stephen's wartime promise explains all this?" "I think," Miss Marple replied gently, "that it explains why a fundamentally decent man behaved so badly." Outside, church bells echoed softly across the village. Inside, another thread of the mystery waited patiently to be untangled. Later that morning, Inspector Craddock visited Alice Morton. William Hargreaves's sister welcomed him into her modest Kent cottage. "My brother wasn't sentimental," she remarked. "What do you mean?" Craddock asked. "He didn't make dramatic statements. If William intended exposing something—" She hesitated. "He believed it mattered deeply." The inspector lowered himself into a chair. "Did William ever mention the war?" Alice became very still. "Frequently." Silence settled heavily. "What did he say?" "He served as a medical orderly. And Stephen Ashcroft." Alice lowered her eyes. "They met overseas." The room fell perfectly silent. "You know this. My brother wrote about it." Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "What sort of relationship did they have?" Alice folded trembling hands together. "Stephen saved William's life." Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the narrow garden. Inside, the implications deepened. "How?" Craddock asked quietly. "They were stationed near a field hospital. There was shelling. William became trapped." Her voice softened. "Stephen pulled him out." Silence settled. "He never forgot." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat opposite Alice Morton. "My dear Mrs. Morton, Miss Marple, did William love Stephen Ashcroft?" Alice looked surprised, then thoughtful. "He loved him." Silence lingered. "But not in the way people might assume." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Tell me." "My brother believed gratitude created obligations. He devoted himself to people who had shown him kindness." Alice looked toward the cottage window. "Stephen became one of those people, Mrs." Bantry sighed softly. "Poor William. He thought loyalty meant helping Stephen keep difficult promises." Alice's voice trembled slightly. "Until eventually." "What?" Miss Marple asked. "He realized protecting someone can become another way of harming them." Silence filled the room. "Interesting. Very interesting."
That evening, Margaret Fletcher returned to Hawthorne Lodge. Her mother sat in the drawing room.
Stephen's letter resting beside her untouched tea. Margaret lowered herself into a chair. "What aren't you telling me?" Edith looked tired. "I've told you everything." "No." Margaret's voice remained steady. "You burned the anonymous letter. You hid Stephen's note. You protected me." Silence settled heavily. "What happened after the war?" Edith closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Stephen arrived carrying grief. Margaret remained silent. "He'd lost someone." "What sort of someone?" Edith looked toward the fire. "A friend." The pause before the final word lingered noticeably. "He promised to care for another person." Margaret frowned. "Who?" Edith hesitated. "I don't know." Outside, the greenhouse stood beneath gathering clouds. Inside, another omission emerged. The following morning, Inspector Craddock arrived carrying military records. "We've confirmed Alice Morton's account." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Stephen and William served together?" "Briefly." "And?" Craddock opened the file carefully. "Stephen Ashcroft received commendation for bravery." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "For rescuing William?" "No." "What then?" "He carried another injured soldier to safety." Silence settled. Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Who was the soldier?" Inspector Craddock lowered his eyes. "Thomas Reed." No one spoke. "Did he survive?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Yes." "And he returned to England. What became of him?" Craddock hesitated. "He died 12 years ago, outside." Autumn rain began softly against the windows. Inside, Miss Marple folded her hands. "Interesting. 3 men connected by war. Stephen Ashcroft, William Hargreaves, Thomas Reed." "Did Thomas Reed have family?" she asked. Inspector Craddock looked toward another page. "A daughter." Silence settled instantly. Mrs. Bantry pressed her fingertips together. "My goodness, what was her name?" Miss Marple asked. "Clara Reed." "And where is she now?" Craddock looked up. "St. Mary Mead." The room became perfectly still. Mrs. Bantry stared. "Surely not." Miss Marple lowered her eyes thoughtfully. "Who is Clara Reed?" Inspector Craddock closed the file. "She worked at Hawthorne Lodge." Silence engulfed the sitting room. "When?" Mrs. Bantry whispered. For nearly 15 years, Miss Marple became very still. What position? Companion to Edith Langley. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the autumn sky. Inside, 30 years of assumptions shifted. Clara Reed, daughter of the soldier Stephen had rescued, a woman connected to Hawthorne Lodge, a woman close enough to observe everyone involved. Mrs. Bantry stared at her friend. Jane. Yes, Dolly. Are you suggesting Clara knew Stephen?
Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully into her lap.
I believe Clara knew more than anyone realized. Inspector Craddock frowned. Because of her father? Perhaps. Or because gratitude creates expectations. Silence settled around them. Outside, rain drifted gently through the roses surrounding Miss Marple's cottage. Inside, another possibility emerged. Stephen Ashcroft had survived war carrying promises. William Hargreaves had devoted himself to loyalty. Thomas Reed had owed his life to Stephen, and Clara Reed had spent years inside Hawthorne Lodge. Then Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the rain-speckled garden beyond her window. My dear Inspector, yes, people imagine debts of gratitude inspire noble behavior. Craddock waited, and Miss Marple's voice softened. They often do. She paused. But gratitude can become a prison. Outside, roots spread patiently beneath the soil of Hawthorne Lodge. Inside, the mystery deepened, because William Hargreaves had intended to reveal a truth connected to the war. Stephen Ashcroft had written that trying to do right had ruined everything. And somewhere between love, obligation, and promises made among the ruins of another continent, a loyal gardener had been murdered beneath a greenhouse floor, while the man everyone remembered remained missing. Part 6. Clara Reed and the House of Quiet Observations. Miss Marple had often reflected that the most influential people in any household were not always the ones who spoke the most. There were those who served tea without being noticed, those who listened without interrupting, those who moved quietly through rooms where important decisions were made. Such people gathered fragments of truth the way others gathered dust, and over time they assembled a far more accurate picture of events than those directly involved. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled beneath a pale, uncertain sky. Rain had stopped, but the air remained damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and roses. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, Inspector Craddock placed a new file upon the table. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward immediately. More discoveries? Craddock nodded. About Clara Reed. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. Ah, he opened the file carefully. Employed at Hawthorne Lodge for 15 years. As companion to Edith Langley. Mrs. Bantry frowned. That is an unusually long time for a companion. Indeed, Craddock replied. Miss Marple folded her knitting into her lap. My dear Dolly, long employment in one household often indicates emotional attachment. Or dependence. Inspector Craddock looked up. Or knowledge. Silence settled briefly. Tell us about her, Miss Marple said softly. Craddock consulted the notes. 34 years old when she began. Quiet, educated, no known marriage. Mrs. Bantry blinked. No marriage at all. None recorded. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. Where did she come from? She asked. Bright. A schoolteacher initially. Then she left teaching after her father's death. Mrs. Bantry sighed. Poor girl. Not necessarily poor, Miss Marple replied gently. Sometimes loss redirects a life entirely. Outside, a faint wind stirred the hedges. Inside, Inspector Craddock continued. She arrived at Hawthorne Lodge shortly after Thomas Reed's death. Silence settled instantly. Miss Marple became still. Thomas Reed. Clara's father. Yes. Craddock lowered his voice. Official records state he died of injuries sustained during the war. Mrs. Bantry frowned. But you sound uncertain. The inspector hesitated. Because Clara Reed never believed that. A quiet pause followed. Miss Marple folded her hands. Tell me. Craddock opened another document. She applied for military pension clarification 3 times. She claimed inconsistencies in the report of her father's final days. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. What inconsistency? Craddock read carefully. Witness statements suggest Thomas Reed was conscious when removed from the battlefield. He named the man who saved him. Miss Marple looked up sharply. And that man? Craddock met her gaze. Stephen Ashcroft. Silence filled the room. Mrs. Bantry blinked. But we already knew that. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. But not what came afterward. Craddock turned the page. According to one account, Reed insisted on writing a formal statement of gratitude before he died. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the statement was never delivered. Silence settled heavily. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Why not? Craddock hesitated. Because Stephen Ashcroft personally prevented it. The room became still. Miss Marple lowered her eyes thoughtfully. Interesting. Very interesting. Why would he do that? Mrs. Bantry asked. Craddock answered quietly. He requested it. Silence. Miss Marple looked up. He requested that a statement of gratitude not be recorded? Yes. Why? Craddock looked uncomfortable. Because it named him publicly. And it created attention. Mrs. Bantry frowned. For a soldier, that is hardly unusual. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. My dear Dolly, yes? Some men do not wish to be remembered for the things they consider obligations. Silence lingered. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock visited Clara Reed. She lived in a small cottage on the edge of St. Mary Mead. Neat, quiet, almost invisible. Clara Reed opened the door calmly. Her expression revealed nothing of surprise. I expected you. Craddock hesitated. Miss Reed. She stepped aside. Please come in. Inside, the cottage was orderly. Books lined the shelves. Pressed flowers rested in frames. Everything carefully preserved. Clara gestured toward a chair. You've been asking about my father? Yes. She sat opposite him. You've been asking about Stephen Ashcroft. The inspector studied her. I have. Clara folded her hands. Then ask what you truly want to ask. Silence settled. Miss Marple, who had accompanied him, spoke gently. Very well. Clara turned toward her. Did you know him? Yes. The answer came simply. No hesitation, Mrs. Bantry blinked. How well? Clara paused. Enough to understand him. Inspector Craddock leaned forward slightly. What do you mean?
Clara looked toward the window. My father spoke of him often.
What did he say? That Stephen Ashcroft was the kind of man who saved others without believing he deserved credit. Silence followed. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And did you believe that? Clara gave a faint smile. Yes, but I also believed something else. What? Craddock asked. That such men eventually break under the weight of what they carry. The room became still. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Carry?
Clara looked toward Miss Marple. My father died because of him. Silence settled heavily. Inspector Craddock frowned.
Explain. Clara's voice remained steady. My father survived the battlefield. He was taken to a field hospital. He recovered consciousness. Her hands tightened slightly. He spoke Stephen Ashcroft's name. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, but then? Clara hesitated. He was told not to repeat it. Silence. By whom? Craddock asked. Clara looked directly at him. By Stephen Ashcroft. The room became utterly still. Mrs. Bantry whispered, Why would he do that? Clara's expression hardened slightly. Because Stephen did not want to be remembered as a hero. Miss Marple folded her hands. He feared attention. Yes, but not for the reason people assume. Silence lingered. Clara continued. He had returned from the war changed. He believed gratitude created obligations. He feared being bound to people forever. Her voice softened. My father wrote a statement. A simple one, that Stephen had saved his life. Miss Marple nodded. And Stephen stopped it. Yes. Why? Clara's eyes darkened. Because Stephen was already bound to someone else. Silence settled heavily. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Another engagement? Clara shook her head. No, something worse. Craddock leaned forward. What? Clara hesitated, then said quietly, an obligation he could not explain. The room became still. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully into her lap. Interesting, very interesting. Did your father resent him? She asked softly. Clara shook her head. No, he admired him. But admiration does not always survive silence. Outside, autumn light faded across St. Mary Mead. Inside, another layer of the mystery shifted. Clara continued. After my father died, I found letters to Stephen Ashcroft. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. What did they say? Clara's voice dropped. That he understood. Silence. Understood what? Craddock asked. Clara looked toward Miss Marple. That Stephen could not accept gratitude because he was already carrying a promise made elsewhere. The room fell silent. Miss Marple lowered her eyes thoughtfully. A promise. Again, always a promise. Then she spoke softly. My dear Clara. Yes? Do you believe Stephen Ashcroft killed your father? Clara hesitated. No. A pause. But I believe he let him die. Silence settled heavily. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked slowly through her garden with Mrs. Bantry. The story is changing again, Dolly said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. And becoming more complicated, Mrs. Bantry sighed. Do you understand it now? Miss Marple looked toward the darkening hedges. Not yet, but I see something emerging. What? That Stephen Ashcroft lived as though every kindness required repayment. And William Hargreaves? He believed truth required release. And Clara Reed? She believed silence caused death. Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. That is an uncomfortable combination. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, because when those three beliefs collide, she paused. Someone always ends up beneath the earth. The wind moved gently through the roses, and somewhere beyond St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes, the past waited for its final revelation. Part 7. The promise beneath the ashes. Miss Marple had often reflected that the most dangerous promises were never those spoken loudly. They were made in hospital corridors where voices were tired, on battlefields where survival felt like the only moral certainty, or in small, private conversations where one person saved another's life, and the debt became too large for language to contain. Such promises did not end when war ended. They merely changed shape, and sometimes years later they became burdens that strangled ordinary lives. Outside, St. Mary Mead lay beneath a soft veil of evening mist. The hedges glistened faintly from earlier rain. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, Inspector Craddock stood beside the window rereading Clara Reed's statement. Mrs. Bantry sat unusually still. My goodness, she murmured. It keeps getting worse instead of clearer. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. My dear Dolly, that is often the nature of truth. Craddock turned from the window. There is something inconsistent, he said. Miss Marple looked up. Only one thing? A faint smile crossed his face. Many things, but one in particular. He placed Clara Reed's statement on the table. Stephen Ashcroft allegedly prevented Thomas Reed's written testimony from being submitted. Yes, but Clara insists he did it because he feared obligation. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Gratitude binds some people more tightly than chains, Craddock continued. Yet we now know he actively suppressed recognition of his actions. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Why would anyone refuse praise for saving a life? Miss Marple replied softly. Because praise is rarely free. Silence settled outside. A branch tapped gently against the cottage window. Inside, Craddock spoke again. There is also the matter of William Hargreaves. Miss Marple's expression sharpened slightly. Yes, he believed Stephen had made promises he could not keep, and Clara Reed believes Stephen caused her father's death. Yes, and Edith Langley believes Stephen intended marriage. Craddock paused. All of them describe a different man. Miss Marple folded her hands. People rarely see the same person, only the version that most affects them. Silence followed. Mrs. Bantry sighed. And somewhere in all this confusion lies a dead gardener beneath a greenhouse. 2, Miss Marple corrected softly. Craddock looked up sharply. 2? She nodded. William Hargreaves and Stephen Ashcroft remains missing. A pause. Or presumed missing, Craddock said quietly. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the darkened garden. Yes, presumed. The word lingered. Later that night, Inspector Craddock returned to Hawthorne Lodge. The house was quieter now. The initial shock had settled into something colder. Resignation. Edith Langley received him in the drawing room. The fire burned low. "I assume you've spoken to Clara Reed," she said. "Yes." Edith nodded slowly. She always knew more than she said. Craddock studied her carefully. "Mrs. Langley, there is something I need clarified." She looked up. "Yes, about Stephen Ashcroft's final days." Silence settled instantly. Edith's hands tightened around her teacup. "I've told you everything." "Not quite." Her gaze shifted. "What have I not told you?" Craddock spoke carefully. "About the war." A pause. Then Edith sighed. "I hoped that would remain buried." "Why?" She looked toward the window. "Because wars create obligations that do not survive peace." Craddock sat forward slightly. "What kind of obligation?" Edith hesitated, then spoke quietly. Stephen was not alone when he saved Thomas Reed. Silence. Mrs. Bantry, seated beside Miss Marple later that evening, whispered, "My goodness!" Miss Marple said nothing. Craddock continued. "Who was with him?" Edith closed her eyes briefly. "William Hargreaves." The room fell utterly still. Even Mrs. Bantry seemed unable to respond. Miss Marple finally spoke softly. "Then William and Stephen were together when Thomas Reed was rescued." "Yes." Craddock leaned forward. "And William never spoke of it." Edith shook her head. "He spoke of nothing else afterward." Silence lingered. Then Miss Marple asked gently, "Why?" Edith's voice trembled slightly. "Because William believed Stephen had done the real saving." Craddock frowned. "Explain." Edith clasped her hands tightly. "There was confusion during the shelling. Stephen pulled Thomas from the debris. But William had been the one who found him first." Miss Marple lowered her eyes thoughtfully, and that created tension. "Yes, William felt erased." A pause. "And Stephen?" Edith hesitated. "He felt burdened." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "I don't understand." Edith looked toward her. "Stephen could not bear being praised for what he considered survival instinct, not heroism." Silence settled heavily. Craddock spoke quietly. "So he refused recognition." "Yes, and William resented that." Edith shook her head. "No, William resented what Stephen did afterward."
Miss Marple looked up.
"What did he do?"
Edith hesitated. Stephen asked William to forget it.
Silence. "To forget saving a man, Mrs." Bantry exclaimed. Edith nodded. "Because Stephen believed it would create obligations." Miss Marple folded her hands slowly. "Interesting. Very interesting." Craddock leaned back slightly. "And Thomas Reed?" Edith's voice softened. "He never understood why his statement was refused." Silence followed. "Until he died, believing Stephen had silenced him," she added quietly. A heavy pause filled the room. Outside, wind moved through the trees surrounding Hawthorne Lodge. Inside, the war reassembled itself in fragments. Not battle, but consequence. Miss Marple spoke softly. "So William felt his truth had been erased." "Yes." "And Thomas Reed felt his gratitude had been denied." "Yes." "And Stephen Ashcroft felt bound by something he could not name." Edith closed her eyes. Yes, silence settled. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "Then we are looking for a man who tried to escape gratitude, failed to escape obligation, and became trapped between the two." Craddock frowned. "That describes Stephen Ashcroft perfectly." "Yes." A pause. "But it does not explain the body beneath the greenhouse." Silence returned. Later, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry walked slowly through the village. Fog had thickened. Lanterns glowed faintly in windows. Mrs. Bantry shivered. "Jane!" "I dislike this case." "So do I," Miss Marple replied gently. "It feels unfinished." "Exactly." A pause. "Do you think Stephen is alive, Mrs.?" Bantry asked suddenly. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Then softly, "I think Stephen Ashcroft is either dead," she paused, or has been pretending not to exist for 30 years? Mrs. Bantry stared. Which is worse? Miss Marple looked ahead into the mist. In some cases, she said quietly, they are the same thing. Behind them, Hawthorne Lodge loomed in silence, and beneath its greenhouse floor, the past waited patiently for its final identification. Part 8. The man who never came home, Miss Marple, had often reflected that disappearance was never as simple as it appeared. A village preferred clean endings. A man left for abroad. A quarrel ended an engagement. A death was explained away by accident or illness. But true disappearances were rarely clean. They left behind small disruptions, an unanswered letter, a habit that no longer had a recipient, a chair at a table that remained oddly empty even after it was removed. And sometimes, Miss Marple thought, disappearance was not absence at all, but substitution. Outside, St. Mary Mead was wrapped in a slow, persistent mist. The hedges looked heavier than usual, as if they were carrying the weight of all the stories spoken within them over the years. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, Inspector Craddock placed a fresh file on the table. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward immediately. More revelations? Craddock nodded. We've identified something from William Hargreaves' notebook. Miss Marple looked up. Yes. He opened it carefully. A single page had been underlined repeatedly. Stephen says he cannot return home as the same man. Silence settled. Mrs. Bantry frowned. What does that mean? Miss Marple folded her knitting. My dear Dolly, war rarely allows people to return unchanged. Craddock continued. There's more. He turned the page. He believes recognition is a debt he cannot repay. Silence deepened. And this, Craddock added quietly, he is afraid people will build their lives around his survival. Mrs. Bantry blinked. That sounds almost noble. Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. It also sounds like guilt. A pause. And guilt, she added gently, is not always harmless. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock returned to Hawthorne Lodge. The greenhouse had been fully uncovered now. What remained beneath the floor was carefully preserved, measured, documented, cold. Dr. Harriet Collins stood nearby, removing her gloves. There is something unusual, she said. Craddock looked up. Again? She nodded. The remains we identified as William Hargreaves were not alone.
Silence settled instantly. Mrs. Edith Langley, seated nearby, went still.
What do you mean?
Craddock asked. Dr. Collins hesitated.
There are secondary fragments. Another body? Possibly partial. Silence deepened. Craddock's voice lowered. Male? Yes. Same period? Very likely. Mrs. Langley's hands trembled slightly. That is impossible. Craddock turned toward her. Is it? She shook her head. No. There was only one disappearance. Miss Marple, who had arrived shortly after, spoke softly. My dear Mrs. Langley. Yes? Are you certain? Silence followed. Edith looked away. I believed so, frowned. Believed? A pause. Tell us everything. Edith's voice tightened. There was an argument. Silence between whom? Stephen and William. Mrs. Bantry gasped softly. Miss Marple said nothing. Edith continued reluctantly. They had grown close, but then something changed. What changed? Craddock asked. Edith hesitated. I don't know exactly, but William began asking questions about promises, about Thomas Reed. Silence settled heavily. And Stephen.
Edith looked down. He became afraid. Craddock frowned.
Afraid of what?
Edith's voice dropped.
Being forced to live as a symbol. Silence. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Not a man, yes, but an obligation. Edith closed her eyes briefly. And Stephen hated that more than anything.
The room fell quiet. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Bantry by the fire. The mist outside had thickened further, darker now, heavier.
My dear Jane, Mrs. Bantry said softly, this is becoming deeply unpleasant. Yes, Miss Marple replied, and confusing. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. Not confusing, Dolly. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Then what, Laird? A pause. Like soil, Miss Marple added thoughtfully. You remove one layer and another appears beneath it. Mrs. Bantry shivered. I would prefer flowers. Miss Marple smiled faintly. So would most people. A silence followed. Then Mrs. Bantry spoke again. Do you think there were 2 bodies under that greenhouse? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Then she said softly, I think there were 2 men involved in a story no one ever fully understood. A pause. And I think, she added, that one of them may never have left Hawthorne Lodge alive. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You mean Stephen? Miss Marple looked toward the darkened window. I mean, she said quietly, that everyone assumed Stephen Ashcroft disappeared. Yes, but disappearance, Miss Marple continued, is often a decision made by someone else. Silence settled heavily. The next morning brought another discovery. Inspector Craddock arrived with a tightly sealed envelope. We found this in the greenhouse foundations. Miss Marple looked up. What is it? He hesitated. A photograph. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. Whose? Craddock opened it carefully. The image was faded, edges curled with age. 3 men stood beside the greenhouse. One clearly Stephen Ashcroft, one William Hargreaves, and a 3rd man, younger, unfamiliar. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Who is the 3rd? Silence. Craddock looked at Miss Marple. That is what we are trying to determine. Miss Marple studied the photograph for a long moment. Then she said quietly, I think we have been asking the wrong question. Craddock looked up sharply. What do you mean? Miss Marple lowered her eyes. We have been asking what happened to Stephen Ashcroft. Yes, when perhaps we should be asking. She paused. What happened to the man standing between them? Silence filled the room. Because in that moment the mystery beneath Hawthorne Lodge shifted again. The gardener had been found, another body had been suggested, a war had revealed hidden debts, but now a 3rd man stood in the photograph, silent, unnamed, and unaccounted for. And Miss Marple had begun to suspect that the true disappearance was not Stephen Ashcroft at all, but the man no one had ever thought to look for. Part 9. The 3rd man in the photograph, Miss Marple had often reflected that photographs were not records of truth, but records of attention. People did not photograph what was most important. They photographed what they happened to notice. A smiling face, a bright moment, a composition that pleased the eye. What lay just outside the frame often mattered more than what was inside it. And sometimes Miss Marple thought the most important person in a photograph was the one no one bothered to identify. Outside, St. Mary Mead was still wrapped in mist. The village felt subdued, as though it had begun to sense that the past it had neatly stored away was no longer willing to remain buried. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, Inspector Craddock placed the photograph carefully on the table. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. The 3rd man. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. Yes. Craddock nodded. We've enhanced the image as much as possible. He tapped the photograph. Stephen Ashcroft, William Hargreaves, and this man. Silence settled. Mrs. Bantry frowned. He looks familiar. Miss Marple said nothing. She was studying the 3rd figure, carefully, not his face, but his stance, the way he stood slightly apart from the others. Not quite included, not quite excluded. Craddock spoke quietly. There is no record of him in village archives. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Which suggests he was not part of the household. No employment record at Hawthorne Lodge, nor military record under that grouping. Silence deepened. Mrs. Bantry sighed. Then who is he? Miss Marple folded her hands. That is the question we should have asked from the beginning. Craddock looked at her. Go on. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Who benefits when a man disappears? Silence. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Jane, yes, Dolly. That sounds ominous. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not necessarily. It simply directs attention. Craddock leaned forward. Attention to what? To motive, Miss Marple said softly. Not emotion. A pause. Emotion is what people show. Motive is what they hide. Silence settled. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock returned to Hawthorne Lodge. The atmosphere had changed. What had once been a quiet country estate now felt like a place where the past refused to remain silent. The greenhouse stood like an exposed wound. Dr. Harriet Collins met him at the entrance. "You've seen the photograph?" "Yes." Her expression tightened. "Then you understand our difficulty."
Craddock nodded.
"Not yet."
She led him carefully inside. "There is something else." They approached the excavation site.
Doctor. Collins crouched beside the exposed section of earth. "Here." Craddock knelt. "What is it?" She indicated a second layer beneath the soil. "Another disturbance." Silence. Craddock frowned. "You're certain this is separate from Hargreaves?" "Yes." "How deep?" "Shallow." A pause, as if it were added later. Silence settled heavily. Craddock straightened slowly. "Another burial." Dr. Collins nodded, but not as carefully concealed. Mrs. Edith Langley, standing nearby, had gone pale. "That cannot be." Craddock turned to her. "Why not?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Because only one man was missing." Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly behind them, spoke softly. "My dear Mrs. Langley." "Yes, are you absolutely certain of that?" Silence followed. Edith's lips parted slightly, then closed again. "I believed so."
Miss Marple nodded.
"Belief is not always memory." Craddock looked toward her. "You think the third man?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the photograph again, then spoke quietly. "I think we have been assuming that Stephen Ashcroft and William Hargreaves were the central figures." "Yes, when in fact," she paused, "they may have been witnesses." Silence settled heavily. Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Witnesses to what?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "To something that happened between them and the man we have not yet named." Craddock frowned. "But we do not know his identity." Miss Marple nodded. "Not yet." A pause. "But we know something about him." "What?" "He stood close enough to be photographed." Silence. She continued gently. "He was trusted." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat alone with the photograph again. Mrs. Bantry had gone home, troubled and unusually quiet. The cottage was still. Only the faint ticking of a clock filled the room. Miss Marple studied the third man carefully. Something about him had been nagging at her. Not his face, but the absence of recognition in others' accounts. A man close enough to be present, but absent from memory. That was not forgetfulness. That was avoidance. She reached for her knitting but did not begin. Instead, she said softly to herself, "Who does no one wish to name?" Silence. Then, slowly, her eyes sharpened. Outside, a distant church bell sounded across the village. Inside, Miss Marple remained very still, because suddenly a possibility had begun to form. The war, 3 men, a promise, a disappearance, and a gardener who had been found beneath the greenhouse floor. But there had been a third man in the photograph, a man not recorded, not remembered, not mentioned in any testimony, a man whose absence was not accidental, but deliberate. The next morning, Inspector Craddock arrived to find Miss Marple already waiting. "You've found something," he said. "Yes," she replied quietly. He sat immediately. "What is it?" Miss Marple placed the photograph in front of him. Her finger rested lightly on the third figure. Then she said softly, "This man." "Yes, I think he is the reason William Hargreaves is dead." Silence filled the room. Mrs. Bantry, arriving just in time, stopped in the doorway. "What?" Miss Marple looked up. "Because," she said gently, "if this man is who I believe he is—" She paused. "Then Stephen Ashcroft did not disappear at all." Craddock frowned. "Then what happened to him?" Miss Marple's voice lowered slightly. "I think," she said, "he was removed." Silence, a long one. Then Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Removed by whom?" Miss Marple looked once more at the third man in the photograph, and said quietly, "By the one person no one ever thought to question." Part 10. The man no one was supposed to remember. Miss Marple had often reflected that the most effective concealment was not destruction, but neglect. People imagined secrets were hidden in locked boxes, buried under floors, or destroyed in fires. But the most successful secrets were simply never spoken of again. No conspiracy was required, only agreement, and over time, silence became indistinguishable from truth. Outside, St. Mary Mead was caught in a still gray afternoon. The mist had not lifted for 2 days now. It clung to hedges, rooftops, and memory itself, as though the village were refusing to let go of something it had never properly acknowledged. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, Inspector Craddock stared at the photograph. The third man. Now no longer just a blurred presence. Now something heavier. Mrs. Bantry whispered uneasily. "Jane, you said someone removed Stephen Ashcroft?"
Miss Marple nodded.
"Yes." Craddock looked up. "And you believe this man is responsible?" Yes. Silence settled. Then Craddock asked carefully, "Why?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Because every story we have heard," she said softly, "has one consistent omission." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Omission?" "Yes. Stephen Ashcroft is described as charming, indecisive, fearful of obligation." She paused. "But never as dangerous." Silence followed. Craddock frowned. "He doesn't appear dangerous." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "That is what makes him dangerous." A pause. "Because he was trusted." Outside, a branch tapped lightly against the window. Inside, Miss Marple continued. "Let us consider what we know."
She spoke calmly, like assembling pieces on a table. Stephen Ashcroft served in the war. He saved Thomas Reed.
He worked with William Hargreaves, and he was engaged to Margaret Langley. A pause. 3 separate emotional bonds. Mrs. Bantry frowned. "That sounds like a young man living a full life." Miss Marple nodded. "Or a man becoming entangled in obligations he could not sustain."
Craddock leaned forward. "And the third man?" Miss Marple looked at the photograph.
"He is not merely present." She paused. "He is positioned." Silence. "What do you mean?" Craddock asked. Miss Marple's voice lowered slightly. "Look carefully." They did. The third man stood not beside Stephen and William, but slightly behind them, almost as if listening, almost as if overseeing Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. "I don't like that," Miss Marple continued quietly. "Such positioning is rarely accidental in military photographs." Craddock frowned. "You think he was an officer, not necessarily." A pause, but someone used to authority. Silence deepened. Then Miss Marple said softly, "And someone who would not be questioned easily." A long silence followed. Outside fog thickened against the glass. Then Craddock spoke slowly. "You believe Stephen Ashcroft was not simply missing?" "Yes." "He was removed?" "Yes." "And William Hargreaves discovered this?" Miss Marple nodded. "Or came too close?" Silence. Mrs. Bantry whispered, "And Clara Reed?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "She believes William died because of Stephen." "Yes, but she may be mistaken about direction." Craddock frowned. "Meaning?" Miss Marple folded her hands carefully. "William Hargreaves may not have been silenced because of Stephen Ashcroft." She paused. "But because he began asking about the third man." Silence fell like dust. Craddock exhaled slowly. "And the body beneath the greenhouse?" Miss Marple looked toward him. "That is where the complication lies." She paused. "We assumed William died first." "Yes, but what if he did not?" Silence. Mrs. Bantry blinked. "You mean?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "What if William discovered something about Stephen's disappearance, and was silenced because of it?" Craddock frowned. "But then Stephen is still missing." "Yes." A pause. "And that," Miss Marple said quietly, "is precisely the problem." Silence stretched. Then Craddock said carefully, "You think the third man is still alive?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked again at the photograph. Then she said softly, "I think the third man ensured that no one looked for Stephen Ashcroft properly." Silence. "And I think," she added, "that he ensured William Hargreaves never spoke again." Mrs. Bantry's voice trembled slightly. "Jane, are you saying murder continued for decades?" Miss Marple's eyes were calm. "My dear Dolly, murder rarely stops at its first convenience." Silence. Then Craddock asked quietly, "Who is he?" Miss Marple paused, then said, "Not yet someone we have named." A pause. But someone who benefited from every silence that followed the war. Silence deepened further. Then unexpectedly a knock came at the door. Mrs. Bantry startled. Miss Marple did not move. "Come in," she said softly. The door opened. Inspector Craddock's assistant entered quickly. "Sir, there's been a development at Hawthorne Lodge." Craddock stood immediately. "What kind of development?" The man hesitated. "They found something else beneath the greenhouse." Silence. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "What?" The assistant swallowed. "A sealed military identity tag." Craddock froze. Mrs. Bantry whispered, "For whom?" The assistant looked down. "It belongs to someone not previously listed in any records." Silence stretched unbearably. Then he added quietly, "The name is incomplete." Craddock's voice tightened. "Incomplete?" "Yes, sir. Only one letter remains legible." He paused. "R." Silence fell like a stone. Miss Marple slowly set down her knitting. And for the first time her expression changed. Not surprise, but recognition beginning to take shape. Because in that moment she understood something crucial. The third man in the photograph had not been a background figure at all. He had been the one who ensured that names disappeared. And now, beneath Hawthorne Lodge's greenhouse, the earth had begun to return what it had been, forced to keep for 30 years. And Miss Marple knew the final revelation was no longer about Stephen Ashcroft. It was about the man who had made sure no one ever asked where he truly went. Part 11. The truth beneath Hawthorne Lodge. Miss Marple had often reflected that truth, when it finally surfaced, rarely arrived in the order people expected. It did not come as a single dramatic revelation. Instead, it appeared in fragments. A name on a forgotten tag, a sentence in an old letter, a memory suddenly corrected after 30 years of being repeated incorrectly. And only when all fragments were placed together did the full picture become visible, not as mystery but as inevitability. Outside St. Mary Mead lay under a heavy, motionless fog. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break the silence. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, Inspector Craddock stood very still, the small military tag resting in his palm. Only one letter remained. "R." Mrs. Bantry whispered. "Is that all?"
Craddock nodded grimly. It was buried deep beneath the greenhouse foundations. Miss Marple folded her knitting slowly. "Then it was not lost,"
she said quietly. "It was placed." Silence followed. Craddock looked at her sharply. "By whom?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said softly, "Let us finish the story properly." A pause. "Stephen Ashcroft returned from the war changed, as we know." "Yes." "He carried knowledge of Thomas Reed's survival." "Yes." "And William Hargreaves believed himself responsible for shaping Stephen's moral." Hesitation. Mrs. Bantry frowned. "And the third man?" Miss Marple's gaze became steady. "He was not a background figure. Silence. He was the authority Stephen feared." Craddock stiffened slightly. "The officer?" "Yes." Miss Marple nodded. "And not just any officer. A pause. One who understood what would happen if Thomas Reed's testimony became official." Silence deepened. Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Why would that matter so much?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because war records were not always about heroism." A pause. "Sometimes they were about responsibility." Craddock frowned. "Responsibility for what?" Miss Marple looked at the military tag. "For decisions that were never meant to be questioned afterward." Silence. Then slowly she continued. "Thomas Reed named Stephen Ashcroft as his rescuer." "Yes." "But Stephen refused recognition." "Yes." "William Hargreaves believed this was humility." She paused. "But it was not." Craddock leaned forward. "Then what was it?" Miss Marple's voice lowered slightly. "Fear." Silence settled. "Fear of what?" Mrs. Bantry asked. Miss Marple looked toward the window. "That someone else's role would be exposed." A pause. "And that someone was the man marked." Silence fell heavily. Craddock's voice tightened. "You believe this man was responsible for falsifying records?" Miss Marple nodded. "Or ensuring they were never completed properly." A pause. And William Hargreaves discovered this. Silence, Mrs. Bantry whispered. And Stephen? Miss Marple looked at her gently. Stephen understood enough to know silence was safer. A pause. But William did not agree. Craddock's expression darkened. And Clara Reed?
Miss Marple's voice softened. She believed William died because he uncovered Stephen's moral cowardice. A pause. But in truth, she stopped.
Then continued quietly. William may have uncovered something far more dangerous. Silence filled the room. Craddock spoke slowly. The officer. Yes. He is the one who ensured Stephen disappeared. Miss Marple nodded. And ensured William never told anyone why. A long silence followed. Then Mrs. Bantry whispered. And the greenhouse? Miss Marple looked at her. That is where everything was finally contained. A pause. Both truth and consequences. Craddock looked down at the military tag. And the body beneath it. Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. That is what remains of a man who believed control could prevent chaos, silence. But control, she added gently, always fails eventually. Outside, the fog began to lift, slowly, like something unwilling to be seen. Inside, Craddock exhaled. So the third man, Miss Marple nodded, is the key to everything. A pause. And now we know something else. Mrs. Bantry frowned. What? Miss Marple looked at her calmly. He is still alive. Silence struck the room like a bell. Craddock stiffened. How can you be sure? Miss Marple folded her knitting. Because bodies decay. A pause, but control does not. She looked toward the window again. And someone has maintained control over this story for 30 years. Silence lingered. Then Craddock asked quietly, Where is he now? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Still close enough to ensure the truth remains inconvenient. A pause, which means, she looked at him, we are not finished. That evening, Hawthorne Lodge was surrounded. Police lights flickered against the greenhouse glass like distant, uneasy stars. Inside the excavation site, Dr. Collins called out. Inspector! Craddock moved quickly. What is it? She pointed to the final section of soil. We've uncovered a sealed container. Silence fell instantly. Carefully, it was lifted. Old metal, corroded edges, inside, carefully preserved documents. Miss Marple arrived just as it was opened. Craddock read the first page, then froze. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. What does it say? Craddock looked up slowly. It is a correction report. Silence. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. Yes, she said softly. I thought it might be. Craddock read aloud. Operational adjustment. Identity of rescuer reassigned for administrative necessity.
Silence filled the greenhouse, Mrs. Bantry whispered. My goodness, Miss Marple looked at the papers.
There it is.
Craddock's voice was low.
They changed the record. Yes. For what purpose? Miss Marple replied quietly. To protect a reputation. Silence. And Stephen Ashcroft? Craddock asked. Miss Marple looked toward the broken glass roof. He was the convenient name. A pause. And William Hargreaves knew it. And the third man ensured he could never speak it. Silence deepened. Then Craddock asked the final question. Who is he? Miss Marple turned slowly toward the greenhouse entrance. Outside, a car had stopped at the gate. A man stepped out, older now, composed, familiar. And as he walked toward them, Mrs. Bantry whispered in shock. Oh no! Miss Marple's voice was calm. Yes, Dolly, the man who ensured everything remained silent. She paused. Has finally come to listen to what silence has cost. The man stopped at the threshold. Inspector Craddock stiffened. Sir? The man looked at the uncovered earth, at the documents, at the military tag marked only, then quietly said, I see you've uncovered what should have remained buried. Silence filled Hawthorne Lodge, and Miss Marple replied gently, No, Colonel Radcliffe. We have uncovered what should never have been buried at all. The truth, after 30 years, finally stood exposed beneath the greenhouse glass, and for the first time, it had nowhere left to hide.